One quiet afternoon at Morgan's Diner, where the sunset cast a gentle glow over the worn tables and chairs, creating a peaceful scene in the small town. James Carter, a man who had endured the hardships of a soldier's life, sat silently, waiting for his son with a quiet dignity that everyone respected. But when two police officers entered, the warm atmosphere of the diner abruptly shifted. Their cold gaze settled on James, and their words, dripping with contempt, quickly shattered the calm, signaling a storm that would turn this peaceful afternoon into an unforgettable humiliation. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the windows of Morgan's Diner, painting golden streaks across the worn leather booths and chrome-trimmed countertops. In one of these booths sat James Carter, his weathered hands wrapped around a coffee cup that had been refilled 3 times already. At 75, he carried himself with the kind of dignity that couldn't be taught. It could only be earned through years of standing tall in the face of adversity. The diner buzzed with the usual weekend crowd. Families fresh from church service, teenagers huddled over shared plates of fries, and the regular crowd of locals who treated Morgan's like their second living room. The clinking of cutlery and murmur of conversations created a comfortable backdrop to James's quiet contemplation. His pressed shirt and polished shoes spoke of a man who took pride in his appearance, despite his modest means. The silver veteran's pin on his lapel caught the light occasionally, a subtle reminder of sacrifices made decades ago in a war that many had forgotten. Next to him leaned his walking cane, a handsome piece of polished oak that had been a gift from his son, Michael, on his 70th birthday. "More coffee, Mr. Carter?" Sarah, the young waitress who had been serving him for the past hour, approached with a fresh pot. Her smile was genuine, touched with the kind of respect that James had come to appreciate in his twilight years. "No thank you, dear," he replied, his voice carrying the gentle authority of a man who had commanded troops in his younger days. "My son should be here soon." Sarah nodded, understanding in her eyes. Everyone at Morgan's knew that James came here every Sunday to meet his son, the town's police chief. It was their tradition, one that had started 15 years ago when Michael first joined the force. James glanced at his watch, an old Timex that had survived 2 tours in Vietnam, and then at the reservation card propped against the salt shaker. Carter, 2:30 p.m., was written in neat handwriting. Michael was running late, but James didn't mind. He understood the demands of his son's position all too well. As he waited, his mind drifted to the past, to the days when Michael was just a boy, looking up at him with eyes full of determination and dreams. James had worked 2 jobs then, mechanic by day, security guard by night, to ensure his son could pursue those dreams. The memory brought a slight smile to his face, crinkling the corners of his eyes. The diner's bell chimed as new customers entered, but James barely noticed. His thoughts were with the framed photograph that sat on his mantelpiece at home. Himself in his military dress uniform, standing proud beside his son at Michael's Police Academy graduation. That day had been a testament to everything James believed in: hard work, perseverance, and the slow but steady march toward justice. A sudden burst of laughter from a nearby table drew his attention back to the present. A group of college students were sharing a joke, their youth and energy filling the space with life. James observed them quietly, appreciating their carefree spirits while carrying the weight of his own experiences. The afternoon light was beginning to fade when the bell chimed again. James didn't turn to look, knowing it wouldn't be Michael. His son always called if he was going to be more than an hour late. Instead, he focused on the family photo in his wallet, thumb tracing the edges worn smooth by years of handling. What James didn't notice were the 2 police officers who had just entered, their eyes scanning the diner with unwarranted suspicion. He didn't see their gaze settle on him, didn't notice the way they exchanged loaded glances. His thoughts were still with the memories of his son, of proud moments and shared dreams, unaware that the peaceful afternoon was about to shatter into something that would test not only his dignity, but the very fabric of justice his son had sworn to uphold. The hands on his old Timex ticked steadily forward, marking the moments before everything would change, before this quiet Sunday afternoon would become a catalyst for transformation in their small town. James Carter sat patiently, dignified and unaware, as the first shadows of confrontation began to gather around his peaceful corner of Morgan's Diner. The atmosphere in Morgan's Diner shifted as Officers Smith and Johnson entered, their presence casting a shadow over the warm, inviting space. The chatter quieted, and heads turned, eyes narrowing in suspicion. James, still lost in his thoughts, remained oblivious to the tension brewing around him. The officers, both in their late 30s, wore their uniforms like armor, exuding an air of authority that was both intimidating and unwarranted. Officer Smith, a burly man with a buzz cut, scanned the room with a hawkish gaze, while Officer Johnson, leaner but equally imposing, followed closely behind. Their eyes landed on James, and a smirk crept across Smith's face. "Look at this guy," Smith said loudly, his voice dripping with condescension. "What's a veteran doing here all alone? Shouldn't you be at home, old man?" The words hung in the air, heavy with disdain. James finally looked up, his brow furrowing as he met the officer's gaze. He could feel the weight of their scrutiny, the hostility that radiated from them like heat from a fire. "Excuse me," James replied, his voice steady but laced with confusion. "I'm waiting for my son." "Your son, huh?" Johnson chimed in, stepping closer, his tone mocking. "And what does he do? Play dress-up in that shiny uniform?" The diner patrons shifted uncomfortably in their seats, the laughter and chatter replaced by an uneasy silence. Sarah, the waitress, approached the officers, her hands clasped nervously in front of her. "Can I help you gentlemen with something?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "We're just having a little chat with this veteran here," Smith replied, his eyes narrowing. "Nothing to worry about, sweetheart." James felt a surge of anger rise within him, but he kept his composure. "I've done nothing wrong. I'm just waiting for my son, the police chief." The mention of Michael's name seemed to provoke the officers further. "Oh, so you think that gives you a free pass?" Johnson sneered. "You think just because you wore a uniform once you can act like you're above the law?" Before James could respond, a young waitress named Emily, who had been watching from the counter, stepped forward. "That's not fair. He's a veteran, and he deserves respect," she said, her voice shaking but resolute. "Respect?" Smith scoffed, turning his attention to her. "Respect is earned, not given. And this guy, he's just taking up space." The tension in the diner escalated as several customers began to murmur in protest. An elderly couple sitting nearby exchanged worried glances, and the man, a retired school teacher, stood up. "You should be ashamed of yourselves. He served this country, and you treat him like a criminal?" "Sit down, old man," Johnson barked, his voice harsh. "You don't know what you're talking about." But the elderly couple didn't back down. "We know enough to see injustice when it happens," the woman said, her voice trembling with indignation. A group of college students, emboldened by the growing unrest, pulled out their phones and began recording the incident. "This is going viral," one of them whispered, capturing the confrontation for the world to see. James felt a mix of gratitude and frustration. He appreciated the support, but he also felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. "I'm not looking for trouble," he said, trying to defuse the situation. "I just want to wait for my son." But the officers were relentless. "You think you can just sit here and act like you're above the law?" Smith said, stepping closer, his voice low and threatening. "We could arrest you right now for loitering." James's heart raced as he felt the heat of their intimidation. "I'm not loitering. I'm waiting for my son," he repeated, his voice firmer now. In a sudden burst of aggression, Johnson reached for James's cane, yanking it away and snapping it in half with a swift motion. The sound echoed through the diner, a sharp crack that silenced the room. Gasps filled the air as James stared in disbelief at the broken pieces of wood on the floor. "Now you're just a helpless old man," Smith taunted, a cruel smile spreading across his face. "What are you going to do now?" The bystanders erupted in outrage, but the officers stood their ground, their faces hardening. "Anyone who interferes will be arrested," Johnson warned, his eyes scanning the crowd, daring anyone to challenge them. James felt a wave of humiliation wash over him, but beneath it simmered a deep-seated anger. He had fought for this country, had bled for the rights that these officers were now trampling on. He was not just a veteran. He was a father, a man with a life and a legacy. As the tension reached a boiling point, the door swung open, and a familiar figure stepped inside. Michael Carter, the police chief, entered the diner, his expression shifting from casual to alarmed as he took in the scene before him. "What's going on here?" he demanded, his voice cutting through the chaos. The room fell silent, all eyes turning to the chief as he approached his father, concern etched on his face. James looked up at Michael, his heart swelling with pride and fear. "I was just waiting for you, son," he said, his voice steady despite the turmoil around him. Michael's gaze shifted to the officers, his expression hardening. "What have you done to my father?" he asked, his tone low and dangerous. The atmosphere in the diner crackled with tension, the air thick with unspoken words and unresolved conflict. The community had gathered, united in their outrage, and now, with the arrival of the police chief, the stage was set for a confrontation that would change everything. As Michael stood before the officers, the weight of his badge heavy on his chest, James knew that the fight for dignity and justice was just beginning. The tension in Morgan's diner crystallized as Police Chief Michael Carter stood between his father and his subordinate officers. His commanding presence seemed to fill the entire space, and even Officers Smith and Johnson appeared to shrink under his stern gaze. "Chief Carter," Officer Smith stammered, his earlier bravado evaporating. "We didn't know." "Didn't know what, exactly?" Michael's voice was quiet but carried an edge sharp enough to cut through steel. "Didn't know that the man you were harassing was my father? Or didn't know that your actions were being recorded by half the people in this diner?" The college students who had been filming stepped forward, their phones still recording. "We have everything, Chief Carter," one of them said, "from the moment they walked in." Michael nodded grimly, then turned to survey the scene. His father's broken cane lay on the floor, a symbol of the indignity that had transpired. The elderly couple who had stood up for James were still on their feet, their faces flushed with righteous anger. Sarah, the waitress, had tears in her eyes but held her ground. "Let me tell you what I see," Michael began, his voice carrying across the hushed diner. "I see two officers who have forgotten their oath to protect and serve. I see a decorated veteran, my father, who was subjected to harassment and intimidation for no reason other than existing in this space." He picked up the pieces of the broken cane, examining them with careful attention. "This cane," he continued, "was a gift from me to my father, a man who raised me alone after my mother passed, working 2 jobs to put me through school. A man who taught me that wearing a badge means serving the community, not terrorizing it." Officer Johnson attempted to interject. "Sir, we were just what?" Michael cut him off. "Just following procedure? Show me the procedure that justifies breaking an elderly veteran's cane. Show me where in your training it says to mock and intimidate citizens who are peacefully waiting for their families." The diner had become absolutely silent, every person hanging on Michael's words. James sat in his booth, his back straight, his dignity intact despite the humiliation he had endured. "Chief," the elderly woman who had defended James spoke up, "they threatened to arrest anyone who tried to help him. They made us watch while they—" Her voice broke, and her husband placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. Michael's jaw tightened as he listened to witness after witness come forward, each account more damning than the last. "My father once told me," Michael addressed the room, but his eyes were fixed on his officers, "that the measure of a society isn't in how it treats its most privileged members, but in how it protects its most vulnerable. Today you have failed that measure spectacularly." He turned to the college students. "I'll need copies of those videos, all of them." Then to the other witnesses. "And I'll need statements from everyone who saw what happened here." Officers Smith and Johnson stood frozen, their faces pale as the reality of their situation began to sink in. The reservation card that had been on James's table now lay on the floor, face up, revealing his name and his connection to the chief, a detail they had overlooked in their eagerness to assert their authority. "Hand over your badges and guns," Michael ordered, his voice leaving no room for argument. "You're suspended, effective immediately. Report to Internal Affairs first thing tomorrow morning." As the officers complied, their movements mechanical and stunned, Michael turned to his father. The stern police chief's facade cracked slightly as he knelt beside James's booth. "Dad," he said softly, "I'm so sorry this happened." James placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "You're here now," he replied, his voice steady. "That's what matters." Michael stood, addressing the diner once more. "What happened here today isn't just about my father. It's about every person who has ever faced abuse of power and had no one to stand up for them. It's about the responsibility we have to each other as a community." He helped his father to his feet, supporting him where the broken cane once would have. "This ends today," he declared. "Not just for my father, but for everyone. The changes we need start now." As father and son stood together, the diner erupted in applause. The afternoon sun, now low in the sky, streamed through the windows, illuminating them both. In that moment, they represented something larger than themselves, a testament to dignity in the face of injustice, and the power of accountability to bring about change. The turning point had arrived, not just for James and Michael, but for their entire community. As the suspended officers left the diner, their badges and guns surrendered. Everyone present knew they had witnessed something profound the moment when justice began to bend toward righteousness, guided by the steady hands of a father and son who refused to let dignity be denied. The days following the incident at Morgan's Diner unfolded with the swift precision of justice long overdue. Within hours of the confrontation, the video footage had spread through social media channels, igniting a firestorm of public outrage that reached far beyond their small town's borders. Chief Michael Carter moved quickly, his actions demonstrating the leadership that had earned him his position. The morning after the incident, he called a press conference on the steps of the police station, the morning sun casting long shadows behind him as he addressed the gathered crowd. "Yesterday, 2 officers under my command violated not only their oath but the basic human dignity of a citizen. My father, James Carter, a decorated veteran." Michael began, his voice firm and unwavering. "Their actions represent everything we must stand against in law enforcement." The investigation proceeded with unprecedented transparency. Witness statements were collected from everyone present at the diner, each account adding another layer to the damning evidence against Officers Smith and Johnson. The college students' videos, crystal clear and unedited, left no room for denial or justification. Sarah, the young waitress, stood before the Internal Review Board, her voice steady as she recounted the events. "They enjoyed it," she testified, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "They seemed to take pleasure in humiliating Mr. Carter, in making him feel powerless." The elderly couple who had stood up for James provided their statement next. "We've lived here for 40 years, the husband declared, "and we've never seen such a blatant abuse of power. They weren't serving the community. They were terrorizing it." As the evidence mounted, the consequences became inevitable. Within a week, both officers were terminated from the force, their dismissal papers citing gross misconduct, abuse of power, and violation of civil rights. But Michael wasn't satisfied with mere termination. "These actions warrant criminal charges," he announced to the Police Oversight Committee. "We cannot expect the public's trust if we hold ourselves to a lower standard than those we serve." The district attorney's office agreed, and criminal charges were filed against both former officers. The charges included civil rights violations, assault, and abuse of power under color of authority. The legal proceedings that followed would serve as a precedent for future cases of police misconduct. But perhaps the most powerful moment came during the mandatory public apology session, held in the town hall. Smith and Johnson stood before the community they had sworn to protect, their former uniforms replaced by civilian clothes, their arrogance replaced by shame. "I forgot why I became a police officer," Smith admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "I let power corrupt me, and in doing so, I betrayed not only my badge but every citizen I swore to protect." Johnson's apology followed, equally contrite. "When I looked at Mr. Carter, I didn't see a veteran, a father, or even a human being. I saw someone I thought I could dominate. I was wrong, and I will spend the rest of my life trying to make amends." The judge's sentence included not only probation and fines but also mandatory community service at local veteran organizations. "You will learn," the judge declared, "the true meaning of service from those who have sacrificed far more than you ever have." The impact rippled through the police department. Michael implemented sweeping reforms, including enhanced training programs focusing on de-escalation, cultural sensitivity, and the historical context of police-community relations. A civilian oversight committee was established, giving the community a direct voice in police matters. Local businesses, led by Morgan's Diner, began displaying safe space stickers, indicating their commitment to protecting all community members from discrimination and abuse. The college students who had recorded the incident formed a civil rights monitoring group, working in partnership with the police department to ensure transparency and accountability. James Carter, despite the trauma he had endured, emerged as a symbol of dignity and resilience. His story became a teaching point in the police academy's new training curriculum, a powerful reminder of the human cost of unchecked authority. "What happened to me was terrible," James said in an interview with the local newspaper. "But if it leads to positive change, if it means no one else has to experience what I did, then perhaps some good can come from it." The consequences of that Sunday afternoon continued to unfold, touching lives far beyond the walls of Morgan's Diner. It became clear that true justice wasn't just about punishment. It was about transformation, about creating lasting change that would prevent such incidents from happening again. As the sun set on another day in their changing town, the broken pieces of James's cane sat in a display case at the police station, a constant reminder of the price of injustice and the power of accountability. The inscription beneath it read, "Let this remind us that true authority lies not in the power to break, but in the strength to protect and serve." 6 months after the incident at Morgan's Diner, James Carter sat in his familiar booth, but this time the atmosphere was different. The diner had been transformed for a special community gathering, its walls adorned with photographs documenting the journey of change that had swept through their town. Michael sat across from his father, both men sharing a quiet moment before the ceremony was set to begin. Between them stood a new walking cane, more elegant than the last, carved with intricate patterns that told the story of service, sacrifice, and redemption. "You know, son," James said, his weathered hands wrapped around his coffee cup, "when I was young, I never imagined I'd see change like this in my lifetime." Michael smiled, reaching across to place his hand over his father's. "You didn't just see it, Dad. You catalyzed it." The diner began filling with people, community members, police officers, local officials, and faces that had become familiar over the past months. Sarah, now head of the newly formed Community Police Relations Committee, moved through the crowd, greeting people with the confidence of someone who had found her voice. Former officers Smith and Johnson stood near the entrance, transformed by their experience. Their community service at the Veterans Center had humbled them, teaching them lessons about dignity and respect that no police academy could convey. They had requested to be present today, not as part of their sentence, but as part of their personal journey toward redemption. Mayor Thompson stepped to the makeshift podium, clearing his throat. 6 months ago, an incident in this very diner showed us the worst and the best of our community. Today, we gather not just to commemorate change, but to ensure it continues. The mayor unveiled a plaque that would hang permanently in Morgan's Diner, dedicated to James Carter, whose dignity in the face of injustice inspired a movement for change. May this place always stand as a symbol of community, respect, and equal justice under law. James stood slowly, supported by his new cane, and made his way to the podium. The room fell silent, hanging on every word of the man who had become their unexpected hero. "I've lived through many changes in this country," he began, his voice strong and clear. I've seen hatred, and I've seen love. I've seen injustice, and I've seen justice prevail. But what I witnessed in these past months has given me the greatest hope of all, the hope that comes from seeing a community unite, stand up for what's right, and work together to create lasting change. He turned to Michael, pride shining in his eyes. My son once asked me why I never became bitter, despite everything I'd faced. I told him that bitterness corrodes the vessel that contains it. Love, dignity, and justice, these are the only answers to hatred and prejudice. The new police training program, dubbed the Carter Protocol, had already begun showing results. Complaints against officers had dropped significantly, and community trust was slowly being rebuilt. The oversight committee, which James had been asked to chair, was ensuring that every voice in the community had a chance to be heard. Smith and Johnson stepped forward, their eyes meeting James's. Months of working with veterans had changed them profoundly. Mr. Carter, Smith said, his voice thick with emotion. We can never fully make amends for what we did, but we want you to know that you've taught us what true strength looks like. Johnson added, your dignity showed us our shame, and your forgiveness showed us the path to redemption. The ceremony concluded with the announcement of the James Carter Scholarship Fund, designed to support minority students pursuing careers in law enforcement and social justice. It was a fitting tribute to a man whose quiet dignity had sparked a revolution of conscience in their community. As the gathering wound down, James and Michael returned to their booth, sharing the simple pleasure of coffee and conversation. A father and son tradition that had taken on new meaning. Through the diner's windows, they could see the sun setting on their changed town, its golden light touching everything with the promise of a better tomorrow. You know what, Dad? Michael said, watching his father's face in the fading light. That broken cane didn't make you helpless after all. It made you the strongest man in town. James smiled, his hand resting on his new cane. Strength isn't about standing alone, son. It's about standing together. That's what this town finally learned. As evening settled over Morgan's Diner, the place that had witnessed both injustice and redemption, the spirit of change continued to pulse through their community. The story of James Carter, veteran, father, and catalyst for change, had become more than just a tale of dignity in the face of prejudice. It had become a blueprint for transformation, a testament to the power of unity, and a reminder that justice, when pursued with dignity and determination, could heal even the deepest wounds. The last rays of sunlight caught the new plaque on the wall, making its words glow, where dignity meets justice. In that moment, as father and son sat together in their familiar booth, the promise of those words felt more real than ever before.
Don't forget to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel so we can keep bringing you the best stories.